Well, a policy change by Winnipeg's Canadian Museum for Human Rights has rekindled a discussion around the word genocide. It's using the term to describe the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, something it hasn't always done in the past. Megan Roberts is on this story for us today. And Megan, what is the museum saying about this change?
They say that they have recognized that by not using that word in the past, Arthi, that they caused hurt for people, and they say that they're learning, they've listened to what people are saying, and they're hoping to do better. So when the museum opened in 2014, they did not label the treatment of Indigenous people by the policies of the Canadian government as genocide, instead calling it cultural genocide, saying that to use the word genocide is not really their call, it's a call of the federal government. And that led to a lot of criticism. There were protests at the opening of the museum. In fact, one of the bands, the group slated to perform at the opening of the museum, ended up pulling out over it as well. And so now we're learning that they have in fact decided to use that term genocide, a call that was actually made a couple of years ago by the new CEO John Young when he took over in 2015, but we're only finding out about it now, and we're finding out about it online. Take a look at this tweet from a person who went to the museum saying that he noticed the CMHR, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, never formally recognized the struggle of Indigenous peoples as a genocide, asking, have you changed your position? And this is what they replied. The museum on Twitter, online, said that they wanted to share that the museum did in fact genocide against the Indigenous peoples and considers the entire colonial experience in Canada from first contact to today as genocide, again saying they're always learning and growing. So let's listen to more from the CNHR CEO about all of this.
Since we've opened, I think we've been very reflective of not only where we are as a country, but where we intend to go. And the conversation about genocide and genocidal policies towards Indigenous peoples in Canada. So yes, there's been some change, but it's reflective of the conversations we have.
So now the museum said that they are in fact using that term. They're going to be updating some exhibits, certainly a lot of positive reaction, but other questions about why there wasn't more fanfare around this, why there wasn't an announcement, and instead we're just finding out about it online, Arthi.
All right, thanks for this, Megan. So for more reaction, we've reached Sheila North, who is in Winnipeg. She is the former Grand Chief of Manitoba. She's also a former broadcast journalist who I worked with in Winnipeg. So Sheila, thank you for making time for us today. How important was this decision for you to publicly describe what happened as genocide by the museum?
I think it was a matter of time because, you know, genocide is genocide, and you can't deny the truth of what happened to Indigenous people in this country. And so I think that now is better than never. And I think that a lot of us kind of assumed that it would happen eventually, but, you know, it's good to see that recognition.
When you say now is better than never, why do you think this decision was made, in fact, now?
Well, it's supposedly the era of reconciliation. And I say supposedly because sometimes we have situations and events that seem to counter that move. But at the same time, I think that as a nation and as Canadians, we're starting to move towards more of that frame of mind where we're starting to reconcile as a nation. And it's important and it's time. And there's many things that are contributing to the discussion, and this move by the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is very important to keep moving along the lines of better relationships with each other as a nation.
Okay, so let's talk about this move specifically and the sort of process. Now, the museum says they recognize the lack of their own acknowledgement of the genocide against Indigenous peoples caused hurt, and they are, as they say, working to do better. Now, the change was discovered in a pretty subtle way, though. It was over social media, and this exchange that happened between a patron of the museum and the museum itself. So what do you think about sort of this announcement of the change in terminology being done over a tweet?
Well, it doesn't give it the significance of that it needs, that's for sure. And this decision and this discussion should have happened right at the opening day of the museum, and even before that, because it is important. So while I am a little bit surprised and critical of how it rolled out, I think that it's almost a way of doing it silently without having to admit a lot of wrongdoing. And I don't think it was intentional. Maybe the timing and people that are thinking things through, starting to realize what has happened and what hasn't happened. So I can see both sides of it. At the same time, I feel like it is better timing now than never, because we have to acknowledge what happened in this country, and that was genocide. That is genocide even today in some ways.
And when we talk about the present, perhaps the timeline is important to note here, because in that tweet, the museum says that they consider the entire colonial experience of Indigenous people in Canada from first contact to today as genocide. Do you believe that it is something that could be classified, could describe what is happening today to the community?
I would agree more today than way at the beginning, but I'm not a historian either, so I'll leave that to the historians. But I feel like genocide started when the policies around the Indian Act, for example, were being created and then being implemented. I think at the time of contact, we were a different nation, and we had different, strengths that may have, been trying to be dwindled over time. But now we're at the other end of the spectrum, where I think we're seeing high numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, for example, the high incarceration rates, the poverty rates, the economic starvation. Many of our nations feel the impacts of is cultural and genocide in general, because it is an attack on a race that deserve better than the treatment that it's getting in its own country. So I think that it applies more to even today, sadly.
And some might ask, though, certainly we have seen the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who apologized for residential schools back in 2008. The current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he has issued a few apologies. Most, notably, we know that to residential school survivors in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that was just a few years back. So does that have some impact then on whether or not you would classify what's happening today as genocide? Because you do have a formal recognition of apology from the government and a commitment currently from the government right now to rectify any issues that were previously there, any injustices that were previously there.
Well, I think apologies themselves only go far, and sometimes they end up being almost resented, because the apology should come with some restitution, and sometimes we don't see that. We don't see those going hand in hand. So I think the acknowledgement by an important institution like the Human Rights Museum is important at this time, because then it'll lead to other institutions to be brave enough to acknowledge that the history tells us what has actually happened, and the whole thinking around genocide and the definition around genocide. So, apologies are of course important, but if you don't follow up with, a true move to achieve reconciliation, then words don't mean anything. So I think time will tell, see how far as a country we can get to really reverse the effects of genocide for Indigenous people.
Now, you made mention there of other institutions. So if we are looking forward from this move from the Canadian Human Rights Museum, and then looking forward, you said other institutions, what do you think should be or could be the next steps following this?
Well, I think that a lot of the institutions have to start recognizing and start teaching about what genocide is and what happened to Indigenous people as a country, and also the importance of Indigenous people to this country. I think that we focus too much on the negative impacts. We also have a lot of positives that as Indigenous people, we don't hear enough about that. We don't hear the resilience of Indigenous people, like despite all the things that have happened and the genocide and all of the social ill wills that happened. We need to hear more of that. So the education piece by all institutions has to be there, whether it's a corporate institution to educational to even in the social services, in the healthcare and justice systems. And of course, the government needs to also address within itself what we can do to reverse the effects of it, including addressing all the talk around the Indian Act and reforming that to be what it was meant to be, implementing the treaties. That's a huge start. We have to remember what the basis and the spirit and intent of treaties were to be able to move forward as a country. If Canadians in general want to stop complaining about Indigenous people living off the social and tax system that they think we are, then I think we have to really get to the table and really talk about these real effects of treaties, for example, that were made and agreed upon many years ago that would start to work to reverse some of the social ill wills that we have in our First Nations. And I think we as a nation and as governments have to be brave enough to start talking about what is actually needed, and Indigenous people have to run their own affairs no matter what, because the prescribed solutions and prescribed ways of living is not working for Indigenous people, and this is the heart of it. The genocide and the whole notion and the talk around that is at the heart of what has happened to Indigenous people, and we have to change that story.